Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on operational resilience. I'm just checking, there's still people joining, but it is just gone past, so we will start. Today we're going to take a slightly different perspective on this subject of operational resilience. We're going to assume that most of you have arrangements, as I would call them, in place already. And now you're in the operate mode. So we're going to kind of focus, I guess, on the operate side. You know, today, as you see, I'm joined by my colleague and CEO, Chris Hanlon, and we plan to give you some guidance or helpful suggestions, if you wish, on how to keep that momentum that you've built, how you can keep that going. So I'm just going to, okay. Welcome to all of you, and we have a few new faces, but those who are familiar with our webinars know I like to put in a quote, and this is one I've used once before, but I like it. Talk about a resilient man, Nelson Mandela. Do not judge me by my success, judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again. And I think if ever there was a resilient man who got back up many times, so, you know, can you get back up many times? Because there will be slings and arrows thrown at you. So to today, very briefly for the newbies among you, a very brief one-slide introduction on who we are. Then we'll talk about operational resilience, and Chris will talk about the project, what you've been doing up to now, just to put it in context. And then we'll talk about business as usual, operating it now. And then we'll talk about demonstrating compliance, because I'm going to assume that many of you are doing this because the regulator said you shall do it. But, you know, operational resilience is a good thing to do if you value your customers and value your business and want to stay in business, because certainly the risks to disruption are growing all the time. And then I'll talk later about continuous improvement, that mode, that state you're in when everything is working well and everything implemented and you're wondering, you know, can we get any better? Well, ask any rugby team in the world, and despite their best performance, they'll still say, well, there's areas we can improve on. And that's an attitude that I would encourage and certainly like to see people fostering. And at the end, then we leave some time. This is a 45-minute session. We leave at least 10 minutes, if not 15, at the end to take your questions. So now I'm going to, one slide, as I said, on the introduction on our company, and then I'll pass over to Chris. Like many of you, we see ourselves as risk and compliance professionals, both from our own experience, and it's what we do every day. And we try to stay in tune and up to date with what's happening in the market by being members of various organizations that you can see here. Those of you who knows will know we make a GRC solution. It's a cloud-based platform where you can store all your risk and incident and third-party information in one place. We also offer a risk advisory service to those who may not have their own risk officer and need additional advice. Today, CalcRisk is used. It's well over 3,000 if you include the third parties that are using it as well. But generally, our market is in the financial services space, and that's from, you know, credit unions, fund management, payment organizations. It's quite a broad sector. And then the not-for-profit sector, public sector, housing associations, charities. So fairly broad customer base. And we have built the tool and the platform, I would say, in the last 10 years based on feedback from our customers. So I think we've a good solution. End of the sales pitch. Okay, let's move on. And I'm going to pass over now to Chris, waiting patiently. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Jerry, and good morning, everyone. I think Jerry kind of alluded to it as well. We've made the assumption coming into this webinar that a lot of people are past the kind of project piece of operational resilience. I think no matter where you're regulated or whatever country you're operating in, there's probably some sort of operational resilience guidelines that's at least a year, if not 2 years old, potentially even longer or more old at this stage. So I'm just going to briefly take us through kind of the project piece, I suppose, of any new regulation, I suppose, but with a particular focus on operational resilience. And we're going to look at it from 3 different aspects. So we're going to look at it from the design piece, the build piece, and then also then the operate piece, which I think Jerry is going to allude to in a lot more detail than myself. So In the design piece, really what the objective here is that we're looking to create a blueprint for our operation resilience framework. So the kind of couple of activities we want to be conscious of under this is, what is the objective? What are we actually looking to achieve by building out an operation resilience framework? Jerry alluded to it a bit there. Are we just looking to tick the regulatory box? Are we looking to say I'm compliant with the FCA rules on operation resilience, or EBA guidelines, or CP 138 if I'm Central Bank of Ireland regulated? Or am I actually looking for more? Do I want to be a more resilient organization because I might have less incidents, less reputation damage, less downtime? It might be a competitive advantage, that type of thing. While we're in that design mode then as well, we're really looking at what do we need in that framework. So again, always looking back at the regulatory aspect, what policies, procedures, and standards do we need to abide by? But then also then looking and seeing what we already have. So a lot of the operation resilience components might already live internally. People will have business continuity plans that might be stretching back years. Maybe we need to enhance or just update those rather than actually starting from scratch. And then what stakeholders then need to be involved as well? So as part of that design phase, do we need to start thinking around our approval process? So where does this all need to get approved? If we have an audit and risk committee, does it need to go there? Is it a management team? Is it a board of directors? And then do we have the right skills and experience in-house to actually build out this framework? And really the outcome that we're looking for then in the design phase is basically a plan that details how we achieve that operation resilience. And as I said to you, that can be just ticking the regulatory box or going that one step further, which Jerry is going to come on to then later on. The next piece then is build. And really the objective here is taking that blueprint or that plan that we've had and actually breaking it down into components that we're going to action. So I already kind of alluded to the framework policies and procedures. And I think the big thing here is drafting them such that you're compliant with the rules and regulations you need to comply with, but that are actually useful for your organization. So too many times, almost on a weekly basis, we come across organizations that have probably bought something or downloaded something off the shelf and haven't really tailored it to suit your own needs. So it might reference jobs that just don't exist in the organization or committees or whatever it is. So as part of that build piece, well, again, back to the regulatory piece, but do make it your own. Do make it such that it actually suits your own business as well. Skills and experience, I already kind of touched on. Do you need any internal or external assistance? So maybe you need to get someone who's experienced in ICT risk or something like that to come in and do an audit. Maybe you need someone who's really experienced in business continuity planning. So depending on the size, scale, and complexity of your own organization, have a bit of a think around the internal and external assistance you might need, or tools and technology as well. And then the last piece then in the build phase, as I mentioned in the design piece as well, is that when we're building, we really want to make sure that we're getting ready for that approval process as well. And by that I mean is that if our audit and risk committee is only meeting every 3 months, let's say, and I know my project plan, I'm going to have my operation resilience policy or framework or whatever it might be done in July, and my committee doesn't meet until October, there's 2 or 3 months there of downtime. So kind of make sure that you're building your project plan. And again, I appreciate a lot of your passes, but building the project plan such that it's aligning with your own governance and approval processes. And then really the last piece under the build, I suppose, the outcome under the build phase is that we're looking for basically a fully documented and approved operational resilience framework that we can put our hand on and confidently go to a regulator, an auditor, or any other stakeholder that might be interested and say, this is how we do operational resilience in my kind of dummy firm. And then the last piece, which I think Jerry is going to come on to shortly as well, is the operate piece, which I think is where a lot of people or a lot of organizations will be. So we've had these operation resilience guidelines for quite some time now. So really the objective here under the operate phase is the ongoing maintenance and management of that framework. So everything we said that we designed, we've now built. Are we actually satisfying those regulatory requirements day to day? Are we satisfying the requirements that are in our own policies and procedures and things like that as well? So part of that is done through awareness and training. So when we have new joiners, if we have team members, staff, whatever it is, how do we make them aware of what their own roles and responsibilities actually are? Are they aware that we even have an operational resilience framework? The reporting piece is quite important, and it's going to become even more important as well, particularly as we move out of that design and build phase and into, right, we said these are our impact tolerance metrics. We said these are our key risk indicators. We said these are our critical business services. How are we actually reporting on all of that? Is it going to the right place? So is it going to the management team, boards or committees or whatever it might be? And then that compliance piece, some sort of compliance assurance or risk assurance or some sort of check that actually goes and says, well, look, this is what the regulator says. This is what our policy and procedure says. And this is what we do. So sometimes I like to think of it almost as like a thread, if that makes sense, where I can see the compliance requirement, I can see my policy statement or procedure, and I have evidence of it actually operating as well. And the real outcome under the operate phase, I suppose, is a more resilient organization. And that at times can be hard to evidence. It can be hard to evidence that we didn't have an incident last week because we had an operation resilience framework. So we'll come on to that in a bit more under kind of the demonstrating compliance heading that Jerry would have alluded to in the agenda as well. But just while we're talking about the design and build phase, and just before I pass back over to Jerry for the operate phase, just to touch on some of those key components that we would have seen people working on over the last couple of years, basically. So we have those business services. Some regulators will call them critical business services, others will call them important business services. Whatever you call them internally, a couple of really important things to make sure you have documented, basically, before you start moving into the operate phase. So have we defined criteria of what is a critical or important business service? Is that criteria really specific to our organization? Does it make sense? Can I go and read it and understand that actually, yeah, it's this much downtime, or it's this much customer detriment, or this much financial loss? That's really important, particularly as we move into the operate phase. So think about it, if you were to operate a new service or launch a new service or product, we then have a metric or yardstick by which we can measure to say, does this fall into our critical or important business services? As part of that then as well, with each business service, when we're thinking about that, it's important to think about those impact tolerance metrics I just alluded to as well. So what do we already measure? Are things already in our service level agreements that we might have with third parties, for example? So don't necessarily need to make a long list of things to measure just because the regulator says we need things to measure. What is actually going to be useful for you in terms of your impact tolerance metrics? Sorry, I'm trying to control Jerry's screen here at the same time. On the process mapping piece, this was a big piece of work when we started talking about operational resilience a couple of years ago. And almost any client or potential client that we spoke to, or even anyone in the industry, when we mentioned operational resilience, everyone immediately jumped to process mapping. So the idea behind the process maps, and I'm sure a lot of you have them well documented at this stage, under each business service, you can have one or many process maps. And I think the big thing now, looking back over the last 2 years, is probably at the very beginning in our process mapping exercise, have some sort of internal agreement on an agreed approach to the level of detail you're going to have in each process map. So depending on people's past experience, if they've done maps before or anything like this, we've seen people who have 100 touch points in the process map, right through to people who have 10 touch points, and they can be a very similar process. So just have some sort of internal agreement on the level of detail you're going to try and capture in that process before you get into the operate phase, because you don't want inconsistencies then going forward. The risk assessment piece, this isn't new to almost everyone on the call, I'm sure. So when we talk about risk assessment, we're really thinking of that identify, analyze, and evaluate piece. They can be internal and external risks. So basically just making sure that our risk register is up to date. So a lot of our operation resilience kind of framework and components, a lot of organizations will be dependent on a key third party or an outsourced service provider, whoever it might be. So just making sure we have the right risk assessments done both internally and externally. And again, that we can document and evidence those as well as part of that initial design and build. So whether they're due diligence questionnaires we need to design, initial onboarding assessments, or whatever it might be. Policies and procedures, I'm not going to dwell on this one too much because I think I mentioned it on the previous slide, but just basically making sure that it satisfies your regulatory requirements, building it into your existing frameworks, or should it be a standalone? Some large organizations have standalone operational resilience committees and operational resilience frameworks and management meetings. The big thing is whatever works for your organization and just being able to demonstrate that you're compliant with it. The OSP register or outsourcing register or third-party register, everyone, both internally and externally at the regulators, will have different phrases on it. Even most recently, a lot of clients, or a lot of people in industry are worried about the Register of Information under the Digital Operation Resilience Act. That seems to be the latest register with the Operation Resilience kind of heading, if that makes sense, that a lot of people are worried about. But again, when you're designing and building out that, again, just making sure that it's useful to the organization, satisfying regulatory requirements, and what it means to be on the register as well. So we're moving an OSP or a third party onto that register. What's actually expected from the design and build piece? Have we a process or a procedure that happens when you put CalcRisk on it or whoever it might be? And then the last piece then of the design and build phase, and again, we touched on this in the previous slide as well, it's important not to leave the organization behind. And what I mean by that is that there'll be a lot of people that, again, depending on the size, scale, and complexity of the organization, there may be a lot of people in the company or the organization that don't know what operation resilience is. So they're used to the usual cybersecurity training once a year and as part of the induction process. But how do we bring people up to speed on what's expected of them from the operation resilience component and what is an operation resilience framework? So have a bit of a think around how you can spread that awareness around the organization. And again, everyone's going to be slightly different, but it's important that this whole thing, all of the doing, the design and building, and the operating of operational resilience doesn't just sit on a shelf and become something that we just blow the dust off when the regulator comes knocking. So have a bit of a think around how you can potentially kind of, get people involved, make them aware, make them maybe metric owners and things like that as well. So I'm going to pass back over to Jerry now, I think, to have a bit of a chat around the operating of all of this, I think.
And I'll unmute myself. And I've taken back the control, Chris. One more tick, and it's on to operate. And I think Chris has given us a very good picture of where I would imagine most of you are. I would hope most of you are, that you've been looking at this now for nearly 2 years. So put us in a good mind position to absorb the next bit. So I'm going to go around the same points and question, suggest the sort of things you should be doing now. You've set up the arrangements. It could have been some time ago, but if you take business services and you set the criteria, what I would say is the context changes. You know, the business environment changes. The business strategy might change. The strategic objectives might change. If you have a change in leader in an organization, it can very often change the direction. So lots of change happening always. And so you should review things. You should review like the critical criteria. You know, if you've had an incident and it's with a supplier who wasn't on the identified as a critical supplier and it wasn't a critical business service, but now you found it is, that'll certainly be a prompt to review it. So at least once a year, you need to review that criteria. And I would say if something happens that makes you think, is it actually, did we get it right first time? In my experience, you know, you get a good stab at it the first time, but it probably takes a few experiences, incidents, mistakes to refine it. And the same with impact tolerances. You know, if you've had an incident and you struggled to meet to stay within those impact tolerances, then you got to ask the question, are they too tight? You know, did we set the bar too high? And if they were easy to achieve, maybe you'd say, did we set the bar high enough? So certainly, when you set them, that was a point in time. And now that you have a bit more experience, you should be constantly reviewing these things. And I would say if you, as an organization, if there's a new strategic decision to add a particular product or service to your offering, well, that might change what you would consider a critical business service. It might be a critical business service. So there are things happening that should be triggers for you to review things that you, and I would hope not set in stone, but decisions you made, shall we say, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months ago. Chris mentioned about the process maps, and certainly I was a convert to mapping, I would say, back in the 1990s. I was one of the early users of Visio and love it. I mapped everything. And one of the advantages of the mapping certainly is, in my experience, you'll identify gaps in your process, things that, you know, situations that, well, if that and that happens, what do we do? And it'll be a cul-de-sac or an open end in your map. So it's a great way of, when you visualize a map, you begin to see where there are gaps in it. That's been my experience. But, you know, again, if you did maps on the 1st of January and it's now the 25th of June, things have changed, you know, and is the map, if you were to redraw it again today, would you do exactly the same? Probably not. So doesn't that tell you something, you know, that there's probably a schedule you should have where you're updating those maps, or if something happens, go in and change the map. In my experience, you know, don't wait, you know, for an annual cycle to change these things. People join and leave the organization, and if you have leavers, and recently I did a scenario analysis with the company and their exercise on cyber attack, and their business continuity plan mentioned 2 important people who had left the organization 6 months ago. These things happen, and you know, when you've got change in people, your process maps probably need updating. So it should be part of that consideration when there is changes to keep them up to date. Again, don't leave it all till December or till January, because there'll be too much to do. It's easier to do it as it's happening. And certainly dependencies, if it's dependencies on people or dependencies on technology or on third parties, these are things you need to be updating as you go. Risk assessments. Chris spoke about this. We do risk assessments maybe initially on a third party, on our own environment. What do you do with that then? Do you put in a document up on the shelf? No, that's not risk management. Risk assessment is part of risk management, but you need to reassess. And I've often been asked, well, how often should you reassess a risk? And the answer to that is not once a year, once every 3 years. It's when there's any change. If there's a change in regulations, that should be a prompt to say, well, how does that change our risks? And there's possibly a handful of risks you should reassess. Certainly, you should be assessing your IT because of the resilience today. I would say a high percentage of disruptions can come to a disruption to our systems. So you need to be testing your systems for resilience. And it's not just cyber attack. If there's a power loss, if there's a severe storm damage, how resilient are your systems? If your hardware should die, and hardware will die eventually. Just be glad we don't live in a very hot country, because that definitely kills them. So you need to update your risk assessments. And I would say record incidents, because incidents is your threat intelligence, or its intelligence at least, because it's telling you that some control may be not working as well as it should. And if you don't record incidents, then you're missing valuable information. If you're the CEO of an organization and the organization isn't recording incidents, you're not getting the full picture. Now, it's not that you use incidents to beat somebody up. That certainly wouldn't be my management style, but use incidents as opportunities to learn. The regulator will tell you about applying lessons learned. This is all common sense to my mind. Why wouldn't you do it? If something happens, something breaks because the control didn't work as it should, fix it, or it'll happen again. And how often have we seen a big incident that happened and we said, well, we should have seen that coming? Why? Because there were a couple of, smaller incidents that were precursors. So to my mind, recording incidents and taking action on them should be normal business anyway. It has a lot to do with resilience, but why wouldn't you do it? So policies and procedures, and this is probably motherhood and apple pie. Yes, things change and you need to be updating, and most organizations I know will review policies at least once a year. But again, if there's a trigger, if the board makes a strategic decision, it might prompt the review of certain policies and procedures. If you do a scenario testing, where you do the what ifs, where you sit around a table and say, let's imagine a cyber attack and what would we do? Often out of those, in my experience, always there'll be a dozen things that you will want to change, and it might mean changing procedures, how you do things. Again, when you did this, when you set this up for operational resilience, it was at a point in time, and things change, and you need to just have that additional prompt, if you like, in your business as usual, whenever you do these things, to keep them up to date. Now, it started off being called an outsourced service provider register, but in our experience, we have customers using the functionality. We call it third-party register because it covers, the contractors, the agents, the service providers, the suppliers, anybody else on whom you depend upon. In DORA, we're seeing, the emergence of ICT registers, just a register for your information and communications technology providers, whatever you call them. I'm calling them third-party registers. You need to keep them up to date, again, because there's changes in your organization and in other people's organizations. So the relationship you have, maybe the contact you have, changes. And you'll be amazed at how quickly this information goes out to date. I'm going to put a figure on it and say 20% per annum will be out of date. So don't wait till December or January to start fixing it, or you'll have a bunch of work. do it as it happens. Due diligence. I would say a very small percentage of you will do due diligence on an annual basis. You do a lot of due diligence up front, and do you check that the suppliers on whom you depend upon, that they're still operating as they should, that they're still financially as sound as they should? All of the preconditions you put in place before you sign them up, are they still in place after 12 months? So there's probably, you don't have to send out another 350 questions, but there's probably, I'm going to say, 20 questions you should probably be asking. And the arrangements, do you visit your third parties? Have you actually examined the arrangements in person and discussed performance? Again, don't leave it till the end of contract for contract review, but should be an ongoing. This is ongoing operating of your business, and the third parties are an extension of that business, of your enterprise. And training, and Chris mentioned this as well, to consider the training of people in the operational resilience. Again, was at a point in time, and things change, people move, people join, and you have incidents and you learn things, and you say, well, we've got to change our process. Well, you got to refresh the training then. Train the new people, retrain existing people if you've changed the process. If you've applied the lessons learned after an incident to improve a process, you probably need to retrain people. So I hope you're getting a sense here for, you might say, well, this is, all day-to-day stuff. It is business as usual, but maybe just to add in a few prompts to your own program of how you manage your organization. Okay, finally on this one, I thought a prompt. You're doing all of this, and someday maybe the regulator is going to come knocking, or indeed your own board or senior management, and say, how are we doing? And I just put a list of maybe 6 kind of reports you might do here on incidents, and I've probably beaten that drum enough now. Record your incidents. Scenario testing. At least I would say at least once a year have a good scenario testing on some particular aspect. Whether it's, we're probably all good now dealing with pandemics and epidemics, but maybe if you lost the building through a storm damage, didn't have a building, systems are okay, but you've no building for people, or you had a cyber attack, or hardware failure. You can probably think of 4 or 5 key scenarios, and you want to know how well prepared are you. Report on that. The board needs to know, the senior management needs to know. And if you do have scenarios and you do find gaps, report on the corrective actions that you're going to do, that you are implementing. Critical business services, you don't have to report on this every month, but maybe, it's every 6 months or so, you give an update. The registers, again, maybe not every month, but it depends on how much change there is in your organization, but you're having those registers and the risk assessments. These are all samples of reports, but I think Chris will probably talk more about that now. And I'm going to pass back control to Chris and talk about compliance. Chris.
Excellent. Yeah. So I think we've covered a lot of the design and build, and as Jerry alluded to with the operate piece, I'm just trying to control Jerry's screen here. Sorry, I'm having some difficulties. Jerry, you might flick forward there if you don't mind. On the when we're thinking about compliance, we're thinking about how do we actually demonstrate it to an auditor or to the board or whoever it might be, any sort of stakeholder. And I'm sure I'm not the only one on the call here who's kind of been scalded in the past of where minutes don't evidence something that's actually been discussed or happened. So obviously we all know minutes are incredibly important to be able to demonstrate some sort of approval process or whatever it might be. But I do know we have a couple of non-exec directors on the call today as well. And likewise, we can minute approvals and things like that. But it is important that the board and a committee, are appropriately challenging both the design and build aspects. So when we're building out that framework, that it's not just boilerplate stuff, but also then kind of appropriately challenging the actual ongoing operating of it as well. So where there are an incident report, as Jerry alluded to, don't beat us up because we had an incident or an outage or whatever it is. Let's think about how we can actually learn from it and what we can do. And then the other big piece around all of this kind of demonstrating compliance, I suppose, is that try and build this in rather than bolting it on. In 2 years' time, there's going to be another kind of hot topic in the world of compliance or risk or whatever it might be. And eventually we'll just have all of these frameworks. So do try and build it in, whether you have an existing audit and risk committee that you can report into, or you already have a risk report that goes to the board. Do try and build it in as much as possible. On to the next point then around reporting as well. So just a point to kind of capture that piece as well around the three different phases that we spoke about earlier on. The design and build is going to have a lot of approval processes, and that could be at board and committee level or management level. That can be a bit exhausting. I know organizations that might have 50 or 60 policies on the board are doing annual review cycles of these, and every board meeting there's 4 or 5 policies or procedures or something going. It can get a bit exhausting. So just think of that as well as we're going through the design and build phase, that we're still having that check and challenge and everything is still getting approved. As we move into that operate phase, I suppose the important piece there is really that we're giving enough information that it's actually useful, but not overwhelming. So lots of organizations, for example, are reporting by exception, where I might have lots of key risk indicators, or my risk register might be 50 lines long or 100 lines long. I'm reporting by exception. So I'm throwing up the risks or the KRIs that are actually the ones that I want the board to chat about. Maybe they're amber or red or whatever it might be on my own kind of scoring system. And the next point, Jerry alluded to it as well on the lessons learned. This can kind of come from all sorts of different sources. And that can be basically fines and sanctions in your own kind of jurisdiction where you operate, or it can be across wherever you might be looking. So as I said, there's lots of different operation resilience guidelines out there, and obviously more coming with the Digital Operation Resilience Act. Jerry mentioned around incidents. They can be internal or external. It might be a competitor or someone local to you as well. Had an incident, you can learn lessons from that. Webinars and speeches, the FCA, PRA, Central Bank of Ireland, they all tend to be quite good about publishing their speeches and things like that as well. Sometimes too good, they can actually be published in advance sometimes. But I think the big thing on the lessons learned is keeping an audit trail of those improvements. So we spent a year or 6 months or whatever it might have been doing all those design and builds. Now we're at the stage where we want to operate. How can we show that the audit trail basically that we're actually tweaking this, we're making it better as we're going along. It's not something that's just sitting on the shelf and we're blowing the dust off once a year because the regulator says so. To measure what matters, and there's lots of different things that we can measure out there, like the impact tolerance metrics. Some organizations will have risk appetite statements with quantitative key risk indicators or risk appetite frameworks and everything else. So really what we want to do is, when we're talking about the reporting on operational resilience, is looking for those few things that are actually useful for the board and the committee, that actually show that we are a resilient organization. And again, do try and build it on. You might already have some KRIs, build it in. You might already have some KRIs that already demonstrate that we're resilient. Do you already measure service level agreements, for example, with your kind of key or critical providers or whatever it might be? So I suppose my point here is, don't have a long list for the sake of having a long list, just because you want to demonstrate you're measuring lots of different things. The next piece, I think, between myself and Jerry, we've well covered between policies and procedures. The important thing here, I suppose, is around the awareness again. So have we got policy attestations? Can we demonstrate that the right people read the right policy at the right time? Is it built into our policy review schedule and everything else like that then as well? And then the last piece then, Jerry alluded to it as well, with the different registers that are probably called for as part of this. So my outsourcing or third party register, I'll have incident registers, risk registers. I might have a register of critical or important business services. DORA calls for the register of information. And there's just so many different registers to try and keep up to date with. So again, it's important that we are keeping those up to date, and it's not just Jerry mentioned to it there, it's something that we touch on in December or January. When we are onboarding a new supplier, do we have a bit of a think? Should they go onto the register of information? Should they go onto our regulatory outsourcing register or whatever it might be? So again, just have a bit of a thinker on how you can kind of build that into your existing processes, rather than it being a once a year annual exercise at a point in time. So that's really it on the demonstrating compliance. I appreciate I skipped through it quite quickly, but I do want to, I know Jerry has a couple more slides and I want to leave some time for questions and answers too. So if anyone does have any questions on any of this as well, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box down the bottom of the screen too. But I think back over to you, Jerry. I think Jerry is on mute, is he?
I did.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you. I thought I'd take myself off. I've just 3 more slides left on continuous improvement, because I think when you get to the where you're operating at the top level, that's this the mode you're in. You're just looking for tweaks, small things you can improve on. But to get there, you have to progress along that maturity model. I'm going to look at the maturity model, learning from mistakes, and key risk indicators. Just have a quick look at that. Okay. This is a slide I've borrowed from Sally Godfrey. Okay, maybe Chris is controlling my laptop, so I shall stop him remote controlling. There we go. And it's something that emerged in the 70s or 80s, this idea, and was originally for software developers, that you try to have some kind of a framework to consider where are we and what do we need to do to get to the top level, the best in our whatever the business is, whatever the sector is, whether it's energy management, risk management, or in this case, operational resilience. So I've taken this example, it describes processes, and I would say most of you are, let's say at level 3, you've defined them, and maybe some at 4. You've defined them and you've implemented them, and now this level 4 will be quantitatively managed. So the processes and the procedures that you designed for operational resilience, hopefully you are now implementing them, actively managing them, and looking to ensure that they're working as expected. When that has been refined and you get to the optimizing level, that's where you think everything is now perfect. I'm sorry, there's no destination in this. You think you've got to the final destination and we're at level 5, but it's a mode you're now in where you're focusing on improvement. Any error that happens, you can say, well, what can we do to stop that happening in the future? It's not that you're unhappy, but your goal is for 0 errors and perfection, and they're difficult to achieve. But I would say it's an attitude you should have, that we want to be the best and we want to continue to improve. Think of the rugby team, World Cup winning rugby team, and they'll still find things that they can improve upon. Okay, I picked out learning from mistakes one, as well as, if you like, if you're looking for ideas on how you can improve, if you're not recording those mistakes, the incidents, the errors, the outcomes from tests, from those scenario exercises, then you're missing a trick, I think, here. Because if you're recording them and analyzing them, then you will spot opportunities for improvement. I mean, be positive in this. As Chris said, don't beat up people because they made a mistake, made an error. But beat them up if they don't learn from it. I would say, no, don't beat them up. Okay. But, if you do have an incident, ask the question, well, did we stay within our impact tolerances? And again, as I said before, if it was well within, then maybe the tolerances are too low, or if it was tight and we didn't meet those impact tolerances, well, are they set too high? Or do we have to spend more money on ensuring that we stay within those? You won't get it right the first time. So incidents are a way of doing a sanity check on things that you decided on before. Now you have real life information. And if you're looking for ways to improve, processes, I would say updating response plans, because resilience isn't just about preventing, the cyber attack. It's about, if you have a cyber attack, being able to respond to it and be back up and running again in half an hour. And it is possible. Many of you have cyber attacks every day that don't disrupt you because they're thwarted or defended off at the gate. But if they do get in and you have good defenses or you have good reactions, you can stop it in its tracks and get back to working quickly. I know this from a good friend of mine who has done this twice and got the company back up and running within a half an hour. So it is possible. We talked about refresher training of people, of individuals. Again, if process didn't go as well, maybe you need to do the retraining and updating procedures and controls. This is all part of that continuous improvement, tweaking the knobs to get better performance. Learning from your mistakes is clever, but the really clever people, really smart people, learn from other people's mistakes. Now, whether you're in a forum where you share your errors and listen to other people's errors or whether you go online and join some anonymous forums, but certainly do look at what's happening in your industry. And if you do hear of a breach in another organization similar to yours, understand how did that happen and could it happen to you, rather than waiting for it to happen. And finally, and we're still within the 45, but I do want to leave some time for questions. If the other one was the head and logically thinking of and reacting, this is the heart. This is, getting extra inputs that are telling you the trends. I see key risk indicators as predictors of what might happen in a month, in 3 months, 6 months, in 12 months. And so often we're focused on the failure indicators. We forget the other ones that might point us. And you don't need 20 of these, but exposure indicators, your own business environment, whether you have lots of cash and you're investing it and it's the investment return and that rate makes a difference to your organization, or the unemployment rate, what it might mean for you, outstanding debt. There'll be key ratios in your business that make sense for your business. Maybe new regulations. I have it down here as a causal indicator, but it might be something on the horizon in the business environment. It might be a new competitor in your space. Who'd have thought 20 years ago you'd have banks that don't have offices in the main street? What's coming down the tracks? The secret here about key risk indicators is don't be surprised. I don't use the phrase emerging risks. It's either risk or it's a not. And if you're talking about succession planning, and that a big chunk of the employees in the organization are going to be retiring in a few years, and we're going to have serious problem in 3 or 4 years when they all retire. Well, you know about it now. It's a risk. Start taking action now. Don't wait for 3 years. It's not emerging risk. It is a risk, but the impact mightn't be for 3 years. Stress indicators. If you want to be resilient and you see that something is being stressed, well, guess what? It's going to break sooner or later. So wouldn't it be a good idea to be measuring where you've got stress, whether it's of the people who are working so hard that the sickness rate goes up? And I've seen this happen as a manager of a call center. It tells you something that's happening that maybe you're blind to, but if you're measuring stuff like sick days, it'll tell you. People leaving, the attrition rate, why are people leaving? It's telling you something. Accidents, incidents, system downtime. If all of a sudden the number of times the system is going down has increased compared to 3 or 6 months ago. I mean, measure what matters. And I would say what gets measured gets managed, right? I would add on to Chris's phrase. Complaints, there are indicators there that will tell you a lot about your business. I can't tell you what is right for your business, but I tell you, look in these areas, causal indicators. And I would see causal indicators as things that mightn't be causing you a problem today, but in 3 or 6 months' time, they'll probably cause you problems. So be alert to them. If you're trying to recruit people and all of a sudden it's now taking 3 months to recruit people that 5 years ago it just took 1 month, that's telling you something. Are you training people? And if the training, and I've seen this in organizations where they'll cancel the training because they're too busy, it might be okay now, but in 6 months' time, that lack of keeping the training up to date is going to catch you. Equipment age, new regulations. I think you get the idea. And then the failure indicator is the one that we probably all do plenty of. Poor performance or failing controls, targets missed, complaints, audit findings, breaches, policy breaches, fraud. We capture a lot of those, at least I hope we are. But capture the trends. Think of key risk indicators as trends. If you've had 3 complaints in January and 6 in February, 9 in March, and let's say it's the 1st of April, you can nearly guess what it's going to be in April. Those trend lines I would say, are gold dust. So the secret is don't be surprised. Have some indicators. So we got a couple of minutes for questions. I see there is a couple in there already. Chris, if you want to turn your mic back on, you are. I'm just going to look and see. Beatrice, hi. I also think that from analyzing the incidents, one may infer to perhaps reassess the risk associated with the incident by either transferring or sharing the risk, or even avoid it altogether, as the cost of managing such a risk is above the risk tolerance threshold of the company. Indeed, that's the sort of thing you should be doing after an incident. Maybe it's time to reassess that risk and say, do we tolerate it, or do we transfer it or terminate it? It could be a lesson learned from our analysis of incidents. Okay, I have a good one here for you, Chris. If one is compliant with the guidelines on operational resilience, to what extent is one compliant with DORA? Is there much more to do? That's a good one. I'll let you answer that one, Chris.
I think you gave me the short straw there by the sound of things. I suppose with DORA, it's probably a lot more. It's a lot more obviously focused on the digital aspect of operation resilience, or the ICT, which Jerry alluded to throughout the presentation. And the regulatory requirements can be quite specific. So I mentioned the Register of Information a few times, where if you're used to maybe different outsourcing register templates you might have from whatever regulator, this one can be quite cumbersome. It's a bit more detailed and things like that as well, but it is a lot more focused on the ICT and the digital aspect. So I would say you need to be aware of both if you are worried about DORA. You obviously do need to do a deep dive into it, but also being then aware of your local kind of operation resilience regulations, guidelines, and expectations, I suppose. But yeah, it is a tricky one. You need to be aware of both, I suppose, the short answer. But I'm sure, Jerry, have you anything to add to that?
Well, what I would say is, and I've always felt this about DORA, I mean, DORA is an act, as in everybody in Europe who's within the scope of it has to comply with it. But I would say, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you try to strive for that level of resilience in your, and it's digital, in your ICT area? There's nothing in DORA that I would say I don't want to do that. So I would say DORA is for everybody. Not all of you are expected to comply with it, but I would say to all of you, look at it and say to yourself, well, okay, I don't have to comply with this, but you know what? It's a good idea. There are good ideas in it. I mean, it covers a lot, as well as just the IT. It covers the third parties, as Chris said, and incidents. But there's nothing in it that I would say is not a good idea. So yeah, if you're looking for stuff to do and you've done all the other operational resilience that you have to do, look at DORA, and that'll take you to the next level. Because you know what, your competitors are probably going to go to that higher level. Okay. I know we've hit the time limit, but if anybody has any burning questions before we go, maybe we've stunned them into silence, Chris. Okay. No questions? No more questions? Okay, well, guys, if questions occur to you subsequently, Chris and my email addresses are here. We're always interested in what people are thinking, so send it to us privately if you wish. It's something that we might address. There is a comment. Just see. Just a thank you. Okay. Yeah, send it to us